Imagine a city, under siege for months, where starvation leads to the unimaginable, cannibalism. In this video, we'll reveal one of the most horrific events in history, where up to 50,000 people were eaten alive. Welcome to the Siege of Suiyang. The Tang dynasty, at its peak, was a powerful empire that spanned vast territories across Asia, home to millions of people and countless cultures. Yet, despite its grandeur, the dynasty was fragile, with internal strife and external threats tearing it apart. At the heart of this chaos was An Lushan, a commander with grand ambitions, who ignited a rebellion that would change the course of history. This is where our story begins, in 755 AD, as An Lushan's forces set their sights on the city of Suiyang, leading to a brutal siege that would soon spiral into unspeakable horrors. If you're already feeling your stomach turn, don't turn away just yet. This dark piece of history is far from over. If you want to hear the full, gut-wrenching story, hit that subscribe button. If you don't, you're missing out on history's horrors that most people don't know about. An Lushan was not always the villain of this tale. Born to a modest family of Sogdian descent in 703 AD, he was a foreigner in China, a member of a people from beyond the empire's borders, yet he rose through the ranks of the military with remarkable ambition. He started his career as a lowly servant, but by sheer force of will and an unrelenting drive for power, he clawed his way into the good graces of the Tang dynasty's ruling elite. His ascent was marked by cunning, manipulation, and a growing reputation as a skilled military commander. But despite his rise, An Lushan's heart harbored something darker. His ambition wasn't just to serve the empire, it was to rule it. As he became one of the highest-ranking generals in the imperial army, he began to grow disillusioned with the very system that had elevated him. To An Lushan, the emperor was weak, the dynasty was decaying, and he, a foreigner, was the one with the vision to save China, by taking it for himself. By 755 AD, An Lushan had amassed power and influence, but his ambitions had begun to blind him. He wanted more than command, he wanted the throne. He began whispering among his generals, sowing the seeds of rebellion, all the while plotting to betray the very dynasty that had once trusted him. His betrayal wasn't just a personal grudge, it was a calculated move, a play for the ultimate prize, the throne of China itself. But what made An Lushan's rebellion possible? What allowed one man's ambition to tear apart the very fabric of an empire? The answer lies not just in An Lushan's cunning, but in the very heart of the Tang dynasty. The dynasty was plagued by internal corruption and overexpansion. The emperor, Xuanzong, once hailed as a visionary ruler, had grown complacent in his old age. While the empire had once flourished, by the mid-8th century, it was rotting from the inside. The emperor's court was full of intrigue, with power struggles among his officials and advisors. The vast expanses of the Tang Empire, once a symbol of its might, had become its undoing. The military, once a well-oiled machine, was now plagued by mismanagement and disorganization. The dynasty's expansion had stretched its resources too thin, making it vulnerable to both internal rebellion and external invaders. The emperor's indulgence in luxury and his negligence of the empire's military and political problems allowed factions to rise within his own ranks, undermining his authority. This instability created the perfect environment for a man like An Lushan, who could manipulate the cracks within the system to launch his own rebellion. You might not know much about An Lushan, but you will after today. Subscribe now, or stay in the dark about how one man's greed tore apart an empire. Don't be that person. As the rebellion spread like wildfire across China, An Lushan's forces moved swiftly, crushing all resistance in their path. It wasn't long before the city of Suiyang, a strategic stronghold on the Yangtze River, became the next target. The city was defended by a small but determined garrison of fewer than 10,000 men. Outnumbered and outmatched, the defenders knew they had little hope of survival, but they refused to surrender. They understood that if the city fell, it would be the beginning of the end for the Tang dynasty. They had to fight, not just for their lives, but for the future of the empire. The Yan forces, led by An Lushan's generals, laid siege to Suiyang in late January of 757. The siege began as most do, with hope. The attackers, confident in their numbers, believed that they would soon break the defenders' will. But they underestimated the resilience of the men inside Suiyang. The defenders, led by their commanding officer, Zhang Sun, had a plan. They would fight not just with weapons but with their minds. They knew they could not win through brute force, so they resorted to psychological warfare. Every night, they would beat their war drums, a tactic designed to keep the attackers on edge. They knew the psychological toll it would take: no sleep, no peace. An Lushan's men grew restless, their nerves frayed as they listened to the incessant drumming. But it wasn't enough. As the days dragged on, the siege turned into a war of attrition. The Yan forces had the numbers, but the defenders had the will. And slowly, the tide began to turn in favor of the men holding the walls of Suiyang. By now, you're already hooked on this incredible story of survival. But you haven't seen the worst of it. If you're not subscribed yet, you're only getting half the picture. You won't want to miss how this nightmare unfolds. As the siege continued, food supplies within Suiyang began to dwindle. The defenders, once proud and determined, started to face the horrors of hunger. What began as small rationing turned into a desperate fight for survival. The city was slowly starving to death. In the beginning, the soldiers of Suiyang had held on to their humanity. They rationed what little food they had, desperate to hold out until help could arrive. But as weeks turned into months, the reality of their situation became too much to bear. The hunger gnawed at them, turning comrades into enemies. The line between humanity and savagery began to blur. It wasn't long before the first act of cannibalism occurred. The defenders, once proud warriors of the Tang dynasty, were now reduced to desperate scavengers. They began to turn on each other, their hunger overwhelming their morals. The dead were consumed, and soon, the living began to eye each other. If you're still watching, you know this story is about to take a darker turn. If you want to hear what happened next, subscribe now, because once you hear the rest, you won't be able to forget it. By August of 757, the situation inside Suiyang had become unimaginable. The defenders had resorted to eating whatever they could find: animals, insects, even roots. But even these meager supplies had run out. The city was no longer a place of war, it was a place of madness. The once proud soldiers, broken by hunger and trauma, had turned into beasts. The most vulnerable were sacrificed first: the elderly, the children, the concubines. They were the first to be slaughtered and consumed, their bodies devoured by those who once called them comrades. As the days dragged on, the number of defenders dwindled, and the survivors became more and more desperate. But just as hope seemed lost, something miraculous happened. A small group of Tang reinforcements managed to break through the enemy lines. But it was too little, too late. By the time the reinforcements arrived, the defenders had already consumed their own. Only 400 men remained alive, and they were the ones who had fought the longest, who had endured the worst, and who had survived the horrors of starvation and cannibalism. You've made it this far, but there's still more to this story that will haunt you. Don't miss the shocking end. Subscribe now or risk losing out on one of the most brutal tales in history. The Siege of Suiyang finally ended on November 24, 757. The city was lost, and with it, the lives of more than 50,000 people. The survivors, broken and scarred, were left to pick up the pieces of a life they could never return to. The An Lushan Rebellion would go on to claim millions of lives, but it was the Siege of Suiyang that remains one of the most harrowing chapters in Chinese history. The people of Suiyang, who had once been proud defenders of the empire, were now nothing more than victims of an insatiable hunger for power and survival. As the dust settled, the Tang dynasty began its long, slow decline. The rebellion, the siege, and the horrors within the city marked the beginning of the end for one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. This isn't just a story about cannibalism. It's about the fragility of civilization itself. If you want to hear more disturbing tales that most people don't know about, subscribe to Disturbing Tale now, and join us as we uncover more of history's darkest secrets. The city of Suiyang was far more than just another outpost on the fringes of the Tang dynasty. It was a critical piece in the war for control over China's vast heartland. Positioned strategically along the Yangtze River, it controlled one of the most vital passages for military movements and trade in the empire. Whoever held Suiyang held the keys to dominance in the region. The Tang dynasty knew this, and so did An Lushan's rebellion. To the defenders of Suiyang, the city's survival meant more than just a military victory. It was the last vestige of hope for the Tang dynasty's future. If Suiyang fell, it would pave the way for An Lushan's forces to march further into the heart of the empire, solidifying his rebellion and bringing the mighty Tang to its knees. The Yan forces knew this as well. For them, capturing Suiyang wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was a symbolic strike that would break the spirit of the Tang's remaining loyalists. The city had long been fortified, its walls thick and its defenses strong. But what made it even more significant was the morale it represented. The defense of Suiyang wasn't just about holding a city, it was about resisting the overwhelming power of An Lushan and his forces. The defenders had nothing left to lose. It was in late January of 757 when An Lushan's troops, numbering well over 130,000, finally arrived at the gates of Suiyang. Their numbers were overwhelming. With such a massive force, An Lushan believed the siege would be swift, crushing the defenders without much effort. He underestimated the resolve of the men inside the city, but the initial attack was catastrophic for the defenders. Suiyang's walls were formidable, but no defense is impenetrable. The Yan forces launched wave after wave of attacks, each one more ferocious than the last. The siege engines, catapults, and archers pummeled the city's fortifications relentlessly. At first, the defenders held firm, but as the days stretched into weeks, their resources began to dwindle. Food supplies were cut off, and the defenders found themselves facing a slow but inevitable decline. The siege was brutal, and the men defending the city could feel the weight of their hopeless situation. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were running out of time. Yet, they still fought on. The defenders knew that this siege would determine the fate of the empire itself. But Suiyang's defenders weren't about to go down without a fight. With their backs against the wall, they turned to tactics that could level the playing field: psychological warfare and guerrilla tactics. They knew they could not win through brute force alone, so they opted for a strategy of attrition. Every night, without fail, the defenders would beat their war drums, echoing the sound of a battle that wasn't even happening. The constant beating of drums echoed through the city, sending a clear message to the Yan forces: "We're ready for you." This simple, yet powerful psychological tactic began to take a toll on the Yan soldiers. The constant noise, the anticipation of an attack that never came, eroded their patience and morale. An Lushan's men were soldiers, yes, but they were still human. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks stretched into months, the psychological pressure mounted. The Yan forces were not only battling the defenders but also their own growing doubts and frustrations. But the defenders' tactics didn't end with the drums. They also employed feigned retreats, luring the Yan soldiers into traps. Whenever the Yan forces would rush forward, hoping to exploit a perceived weakness in the city's defense, the defenders would suddenly retreat, only to ambush them with deadly precision once the attackers were in the open. It was a tactic used by the best soldiers throughout history: lead your enemy into a false sense of victory, then strike when they least expect it. One of the most successful tactics the defenders used was a late-night cavalry raid. They would send out small groups of mounted archers, hitting the Yan forces when they were least prepared, while they were resting, while they were sleeping. The attackers, already weary and mentally drained, began to make mistakes. They were losing their edge, and the defenders, though dwindling in numbers, began to claw back a bit of hope. Yet, despite the cunning and resourcefulness of the defenders, the odds were still stacked against them. The psychological pressure from within the city was just as brutal as the attacks from without. As supplies dwindled and hunger began to take its toll, the question became not just how long they could hold out, but how much longer they could maintain the fight. If you're not already feeling the tension, do yourself a favor and subscribe now. This is just the beginning. How long can you last without hearing what happens next? Hit subscribe and brace yourself for what's coming, because the worst is yet to come. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. The once hopeful defenders of Suiyang began to realize the gravity of their situation. What had started as a siege, a desperate battle to protect a city, to save an empire, was now a fight against time itself. Every day, the gap between survival and death grew smaller. The siege dragged on longer than anyone had expected. The attackers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Inside the walls, the defenders watched as their food supplies dwindled. First, the grain ran out. Then the rice. By the time the first few weeks had passed, they were reduced to eating whatever scraps they could find, animals, vegetables, anything. But even these were quickly exhausted. As the food situation worsened, the defenders began to feel the gnawing, insatiable hunger that consumed their every thought. They were losing the battle, not just against the enemy outside the city, but against their own bodies, against their own survival instincts. The once proud defenders, men and women who had sworn to protect the city, were now reduced to scavengers. They became desperate. The faint hope they once held on to, that reinforcements would arrive or the siege would be lifted, slowly began to fade away. Day by day, the city was shrinking, not just in numbers, but in spirit. What happens when a city's walls can no longer protect you? When the food runs out, when your fellow soldiers are too weak to continue fighting, and the enemy is right outside, waiting for you to break? That is the reality the defenders of Suiyang faced. The siege was no longer a battle for survival, it was a countdown to their eventual extinction. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the hunger inside Suiyang became unbearable. The first signs of cannibalism appeared, not in the form of a deliberate, premeditated act, but as a desperate, twisted response to the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. It started slowly. At first, it was the dead. When a soldier or civilian died from starvation, their bodies were left to rot, abandoned on the streets, until the hunger became too great. Then, the unthinkable happened. The bodies that had once been left untouched became the first to be consumed. What had once been a sacred taboo was slowly forgotten in the face of starvation. As the city continued to starve, the distinction between the living and the dead began to blur. What was once sacred, human life, was now reduced to mere sustenance. Soldiers and civilians alike were driven by the same basic need, survival. It didn't matter who you were, or what role you played in the defense of Suiyang. All that mattered now was feeding the beast that gnawed at your insides. The first to be sacrificed were the elderly, the sick, the children, those whose survival was already in doubt. They were the ones who had the least strength, the least chance of making it through the siege. They were the first to be consumed. But as hunger continued to eat away at the defenders, the line between who would be spared and who would be devoured began to fade. What does it take to break a human spirit? To push someone, not just to the edge, but beyond it, into an abyss from which they cannot return? The defenders of Suiyang were once proud warriors, men and women who swore an oath to defend the city at all costs. But as the siege dragged on, their resolve began to crack. Starvation twisted their minds, eroded their dignity, and turned them into something unrecognizable. The psychological toll of the siege was just as destructive as the physical toll. With each passing day, the defenders began to lose their will. The hunger that plagued them wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It gnawed at their sanity, turning them into paranoid, desperate shadows of who they once were. Imagine waking up every day, not knowing if you'll survive until tomorrow. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, everything was a constant reminder that you were living on borrowed time. The air in Suiyang grew thick with despair, the stench of death and decay creeping through the streets. The defenders could hear the cries of the dying, the sounds of cannibalism echoing in the corners of the city. The once proud walls of Suiyang now felt like a tomb, a prison that was slowly suffocating its inhabitants. Each meal became a moral quandary. Who would be sacrificed next? Who would be left to die in the streets so others could survive a little longer? And who would take the next step into the abyss and consume another human being? As the defenders continued to eat the bodies of their comrades, they were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting to hold on to whatever humanity they had left. The siege had stripped them of their dignity, their hope, and eventually, their souls. They were no longer defenders. They were the last remnants of a city that had long since fallen to desperation. The horror inside Suiyang is almost beyond belief, but it's only going to get worse. If you want to know what happens when desperation takes over, make sure you subscribe. Otherwise, don't complain when you don't know what comes next. The first gruesome act of cannibalism was not planned. It wasn't a calculated decision made by the leaders of the defenders, it was a spontaneous act of desperation. It all began when one of the defenders, a soldier who had long since been weakened by starvation, collapsed in the street. His body, emaciated and frail from lack of food, was left behind as the siege dragged on. At first, there was hesitation, even from those whose minds had already begun to fray from hunger. But hunger is a powerful force, a primal instinct that can override reason, morality, and every other form of restraint. The first soldier to break was not the weakest or the most starved. It was the one who, in a moment of utter despair, took the first bite. He had crossed the point of no return. It was no longer a matter of military strategy or defending the empire. Now, it was survival at all costs. The first act of cannibalism didn't just shatter the defense of the city, it shattered the humanity of those within it. The act of consuming another human being in such a desperate moment became a dark, twisted necessity for survival. Once the first bite was taken, the floodgates opened. It wasn't long before others followed. But the first victims weren't soldiers, they were the most vulnerable, the ones who could not defend themselves. The elderly, the sick, the children, those who had no place in a city slowly being devoured by starvation. As the days passed, the defenders devised an unspoken hierarchy, a system of sacrifice that would ensure their survival for just a little longer. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, it was merely survival instinct dictating who would be eaten. But over time, the hierarchy became a cruel necessity. The concubines, women who were seen as expendable in the eyes of the men, were the first to be sacrificed. Then, the elderly, those whose frailty made them unlikely to survive the siege anyway, became the next target. Next came the children, small, vulnerable, and innocent, but their lives had already been shattered by the horrors around them. The line between the living and the dead became blurred. No one was safe. The men who had once been strong and noble warriors, now reduced to animals in the eyes of the others, began to look at each other with suspicion. Every man knew that if he was not careful, he too could become part of the system of sacrifice. As the hierarchy grew, so did the brutality. The defenders knew that, eventually, they would have to turn on the fighting-age men, those who could still fight and defend the city. But even those men had to come to terms with the truth. Survival meant crossing every moral boundary that had once defined them as human. The city of Suiyang, once a place of pride and strength, had become a meat grinder, a place where human life was weighed against the desperate hunger gnawing at everyone's stomach. In the end, only the strongest would survive. But at what cost? The psychological toll of cannibalism was devastating. It wasn't just the act of consuming another human being, it was the transformation that occurred in the minds of the defenders. The very fabric of their humanity began to unravel. With each bite, with each victim they sacrificed, the defenders were forced to confront an unsettling truth: they had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The first time a soldier consumed human flesh, he did it in a state of madness, driven by hunger and a primal need to survive. But with each subsequent act, the psychological damage grew. They were no longer fighting for honor, for duty, or for the survival of the empire, they were fighting for their next meal. The once proud warriors of the Tang dynasty had been reduced to desperate animals, consumed by their most basic instincts. What happens when a man is forced to eat the flesh of another human? It's a question that goes beyond survival. It's about losing oneself in the process. The defenders who partook in the cannibalism were no longer the men they had once been. They had crossed into a dark, unimaginable place, where nothing remained but their hunger and their will to live. The trauma was not just physical, it was psychological. The act of cannibalism was not something that could be erased from their minds. The memories of what they had done haunted them long after the siege had ended. They had seen the faces of their comrades, their fellow soldiers, twisted with the same desperation and hunger that they themselves had felt. As the defenders consumed their fallen comrades, they became part of something larger than themselves, a grotesque cycle of survival that eroded their sanity. They began to question everything. Who were they? What had they become? Were they still human? Or had they become something else entirely, something monstrous? The city, once a symbol of resistance, had become a hellscape where the very concept of humanity was devoured, one bite at a time. This part of the story is one that will stick with you forever. If you want to know just how far human desperation can go, subscribe and stay tuned. If not, don't bother complaining about missing this chilling part of history. As the days bled into weeks, the defenders' hope began to fade. What had once been a tightly knit, determined group of warriors had now fractured under the unbearable pressure of hunger and the horrors of cannibalism. The acts of desperation that had once seemed inconceivable became a grim reality that weighed on their souls. Every corner of the city held the ghosts of those they had consumed, and every act of survival brought with it an overwhelming sense of guilt. The men who had once marched with pride and valor now trudged through the streets, hollow-eyed, their steps heavy with the weight of their actions. Their morale, once strong, was now shattered. They no longer fought for glory, or even for the Tang dynasty, they fought only to stave off death for just one more hour, one more minute. But even in the face of their inner destruction, the defenders kept fighting. The instinct to survive was something they could not escape, no matter how broken their spirits had become. It was as if their minds had numbed to the horror around them, and all that was left was the mechanical drive to keep going, to keep the enemy at bay just a little longer. The city of Suiyang had become a mausoleum, a place where the living fought with the dead in an eternal, mind-numbing struggle. The defenders had long since ceased to be soldiers in the traditional sense. They were now just shells of their former selves, driven by a singular, brutal need to survive. Their humanity had been left behind, buried beneath layers of trauma, starvation, and unspeakable acts. And yet, despite all this, they fought. Outside the city walls, the Yen forces, though demoralized by their failure to break the defenses earlier, were now fueled by a sense of inevitability. They had seen the signs of desperation in the defenders. They knew the city was weakening. The once unimaginable idea that Suiyang might hold out against the might of the Yen forces had become a distant memory. The siege engines, which had pounded relentlessly against the walls for weeks, began to find their mark. Cracks started to appear in the mighty fortifications, the once impregnable city slowly losing its grip on survival. The attackers were relentless now, pushing against the defenses with an intensity born from the knowledge that the defenders were close to breaking. But what really made the difference was the intelligence the Yen forces had gathered. They knew that Suiyang's defenders were not just physically exhausted, they were mentally broken. The once proud walls of the city, which had stood for centuries, now seemed fragile, worn down by months of battle. The moral fiber of the defenders had been gutted, leaving the city exposed. One final push from the Yen forces was all it took. The breaches in the walls grew wider. The defenders, already weakened by hunger and madness, began to falter. The last of their ammunition ran out, and their ability to continue fighting with any sort of strategy was gone. As the Yen forces finally breached the outer defenses, a deep sense of dread washed over the defenders. They could hear the sound of boots on the cobblestones, the battle cries of the attackers growing louder with every passing moment. The fight was over. Inside the city, the remaining 400 defenders were surrounded by the overwhelming might of An Lushan's army. Starving, sick, and broken, they could barely lift their weapons. Yet, they refused to lay down their arms. They would not give in, even as they knew the end was near. They fought like animals, desperate to defend the ruins of their city, but the battle was no longer about strategy. It was about survival, pure and simple. Each swing of the sword, each arrow shot, was an act of defiance against an enemy they knew would eventually overwhelm them. The attackers pushed forward, slowly but surely, each step marking the inevitable collapse of Suiyang. And with every step, the defenders' final resolve was worn down, their bodies and spirits crushed under the weight of the siege. By the final days of the siege, there was no dignity left in the defense of Suiyang. The defenders fought not for honor, but for a cruel, fleeting hope that somehow, someone might come to their aid. But there was no rescue. There would be no salvation. They had fought for so long, only to watch their efforts crumble into dust. When the final blow was struck, when the last of the defenders was either killed or captured, the city of Suiyang had fallen. Only a handful of soldiers remained alive, the last remnants of a once great defense that had been obliterated by hunger, desperation, and the cruelty of war. The survivors, those who had managed to escape the initial onslaught, were left with only one option: surrender. They had fought until they could fight no more. They had endured unimaginable horrors, and now they faced the ultimate reckoning. The city of Suiyang had been lost. The Yan forces had won. But the victory was hollow. The price of it had been the complete destruction of a people, their city, and their humanity. Those who surrendered were not met with mercy, but with cold disdain. They had lost everything: family, comrades, honor. The survivors were taken captive, their fate sealed. What happened to them after the surrender is unclear, but history suggests that they were subjected to the same fate as the defenders who had fallen before them: exiled, tortured, or executed. And so, the Siege of Suiyang came to its tragic end. A city that had once stood strong and proud was now reduced to nothing more than a grim memory. The horrors of cannibalism, of betrayal, of unthinkable suffering, these would forever mark the history of the Tang dynasty, and of China itself. The echoes of Suiyang's fall would resonate for centuries, a stark reminder of the darkness that can descend when survival becomes the only law. You've made it this far, but there's so much more to learn. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on how this siege changed the course of history. Don't let this opportunity pass you by. When the dust settled over the broken city of Suiyang, it was clear that the human cost was unimaginable. 50,000 lives lost, not in a single battle, but in a prolonged siege, a desperate struggle for survival that tore apart the very soul of the city. Of the original 10,000 defenders who stood proudly against An Lushan's forces, only a fraction remained alive. The rest had been consumed by the gnawing hunger, devoured by the grim necessity of survival, or slaughtered in the final push of the Yan forces. But the death toll didn't stop with the defenders. Within the walls of Suiyang, the civilians, those who had once lived in peace and security, were sacrificed in the most brutal of ways. The elderly, the children, the women, the sick, all of them had perished, either in the siege itself or as part of the horrific cycle of cannibalism that had taken hold inside the city. The emotional and physical toll on the surviving defenders was incalculable. To have been part of such atrocities and to live with the memories of what they had done, the guilt was too much for many to bear. The survivors, when finally freed from the walls of Suiyang, were left to roam the remnants of a world they could never return to, broken by the horrors they had witnessed. The Yan forces, though victorious, were equally scarred. The city they had conquered was a symbol of their victory, but it was also a testament to the depths of human desperation. The destruction that had taken place within Suiyang could never be undone. The 50,000 souls who perished, who fought for their survival, were now part of history's darkest legacy. A city that had once been a beacon of strength and pride was now a graveyard, a scar on the land that would forever remind the world of the cost of war and the fragility of civilization. But the fall of Suiyang was not just the end of a city, it was a turning point in the larger war. An Lushan's rebellion, which had started as a civil war within the Tang dynasty, had been marked by violence, betrayal, and suffering on a scale that was almost beyond comprehension. The rebellion eventually sputtered to an end, but the damage it caused would last far beyond the rebellion's official collapse. The Tang dynasty, once a mighty empire, was irrevocably weakened by the rebellion. The internal strife, the loss of so many lives, and the economic devastation caused by the war left the dynasty in ruins. The rebellion had torn apart the very heart of the empire, and though the Tang would continue for a time, it was clear that the rebellion had left permanent scars. The internal power struggles that followed only deepened the wounds, and the once great empire of the Tang was now a shadow of its former self. Beyond the Tang dynasty, the rebellion had lasting implications for the broader world. It left a legacy of fear and distrust that would resonate through Chinese history. The brutality of An Lushan's rebellion, and the horrors of the Siege of Suiyang, would serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that lies just beneath the surface of even the most powerful empires. It showed the world just how fragile power could be, how quickly an empire could collapse under the weight of betrayal, starvation, and internal corruption. The fall of Suiyang and the horrors that took place within its walls are more than just a dark chapter in Chinese history, they are a reflection of the depths to which humanity can sink when pushed to the very edge. The defenders of Suiyang were not just fighting an external enemy, they were fighting themselves, struggling against the primal forces that drive human survival. When faced with the unimaginable, they crossed lines that should never be crossed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Siege of Suiyang is the way it highlights the fragility of civilization. In moments of extreme desperation, all the ideals that hold a society together, honor, morality, duty, disappear in the face of hunger and survival. The defenders of Suiyang, once proud soldiers of the Tang dynasty, became nothing more than desperate animals, fighting for their next meal, willing to do anything, no matter how monstrous, to stay alive. The tragedy of Suiyang is not just the loss of a city, it is the loss of humanity itself. It is a sobering reminder that in the face of war, in the face of starvation and suffering, the lines between civilization and savagery can quickly blur. The defenders, the attackers, and even the survivors, they were all forever marked by what happened within those walls. And so, the Siege of Suiyang stands as a chilling testament to the darkest side of human nature. It shows us that when pushed to the absolute limit, when there is no escape, no way out, we can all become something far darker than we ever imagined. This is the final chapter of Suiyang, but there are countless other stories waiting to be told. If you don't want to miss the next disturbing tale, subscribe and leave a comment about why you haven't yet. This is the history that will haunt you. If this story shocked you and left you in disbelief, let us know in the comments below. What part of the Siege of Suiyang shocked you the most? And if you haven't subscribed yet, well, you've missed out on more horrifying tales. Subscribe now and be part of the disturbing journey.